Ben and Marla, who I never met, but I'll start with an anecdote because I remember the day of the Hebrew University bombing very, very well. I was the editor of Focus, which is the Rothberg School's newsletter. I was the editor for many years, something like 10, 12 years. And 18 years ago, I was a young mother. I was actually in the States. And when the bomb went off, I knew that I would know people who had been in the cafeteria because so many of my fellow staff members in Rothberg ate there. I used to eat there when I was at Rothberg when I was doing work there. And you had someone named Janet Coulter, who I had met, was sitting with a colleague of hers who I had also known who was wounded. And I remember where I was, meaning it was a significant enough event that it was very much seared into my memory. And then Rothberg had me write a story about the bombing and about the victims. And as a result, I stepped into Pardes for the first time. I was not yet a teacher, I was a writer. And I would say Ben and Marla brought me to Pardes. I remember sitting with David, I don't know if he remembers, but I sat and I interviewed him, and I wrote little biographical sketches of each of them that were then printed in Focus. I believe, Catherine, we sent you a copy because I think you might have even written back thanking me. I mean, I do remember, it's something I remember that the parents thanked me for the little piece that I did. And that really brought together, Pardes and Ben and Marla for me in a very visceral way, so much so that when I say Yisker, I think of them, like that they were names and faces that became familiar to me through that work, and I was very touched by their story. And then, every year I teach then I came to Pardes as a teacher, and every year we commemorate their Yortzeit in the Baby Drush, and David Richmond gets up and talks about Ben in such a personal way, such a moving way. Every year he cries, and it's been so many years, and he tells the funny stories and so on. And so, it shows that how Yortzeit really does what it's supposed to do, which is to continue the memory, perpetuate the memory. So in effect, even those who never met Ben and Marla are reminded of their presence and who they were and the legacy they have left behind. So I just wanted to open with that because I'm very moved. As soon as David sent out, well, who wants to speak and who's around, and it's summer and vacation, I right away said, yes, what a privilege. And especially after teaching Catherine this summer, what another connection to add to this very layered relationship. So thank you.
Beautiful. Amanda is here.
Okay, wonderful.
That's Amanda, it. I should start. I'm ready.
Please.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. I have the honor of giving you an introduction to Ben and Marla. And it's been 18 years, and I remember them as they were 18 years ago. Ben was my chavruta, and I had the pleasure of learning with him every morning. And Marla was a dear friend. And as I was thinking about, what could I say about them to sort of share them with you, for the first few years, when I had the opportunity to talk about them, I talked about who they were, their personalities, and what they liked, and something about that didn't feel like enough after 18 years. It didn't feel fair to keep them as they were when all of us have moved on and moved forward so much. So instead of sharing who they were, I wanted to share with you who I imagined they would be as teachers. As somebody who runs a school, I think a lot about the different teachers, different people in on my faculty who connect with different students and approach kids in different ways. And so I decided to think about who they would be to help us both understand who they were, and also to bring a little bit of what the world has missed from not having them in it, and all the children that they haven't gotten to teach. So if you'll indulge me, I'm gonna share a portrait of Ben as a teacher and a portrait of Marla as the teachers that they never got to be. Ben teaches high school. He is a really fun teacher and he has great energy. He introduces kids to new music and listens to what they're listening to so he can tell them why his music is better. He is a fierce advocate for every child. He connects to the kids who struggle, to the ones who struggle to connect with every other one of their teachers. He teaches them to love Torah, especially the ones who have avoided loving Torah for their whole lives in day school. He shows up for them and they show up for him. Marla is a warm and loving teacher. The kids can't wait to get to her classroom. She could teach any grade level. She's amazing with the little ones, but she chooses to teach middle school because they deserve someone who connects to them, someone who advocates for them, someone who cares about them, and someone who makes it her business to share their interests. She makes learning Torah a joy. She asks kids to find their own meaning and their own connections to the content. She inspires. They run to her classroom every morning. That's what I imagine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think David, do you want to say anything or shall I start?
No, please, Nechama, please.
Okay, so I'm Nechama Goldman Barish, and by the way, Esther Abramowitz, I see you on the screen, and I knew you back in Rothberg 18 years ago, right? That was one of Esther was working at Hillel, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. A lot of connections. So I'm a senior faculty member at Pardes. I am very much involved in teaching and studying matters having to do with gender in halacha, gender in rabbinic texts. I'm working on a book on that topic. And what I've chosen here are stories having to do, or narratives having to do with love and marriage, with relationships. And of course, it's very bittersweet because neither Marla nor Ben married and had families. And so Amanda spoke about continuity, and here we are 18 years later, and people have moved on with their lives. And I'm sure one of the signs is children who have been born in that interim and seeing how they've grown up. And so we're going to learn something that they did not achieve in their lives, and yet in their memory we will delve into Torah on this topic, and they've left behind such a rich legacy, similar to what we hope to leave behind when we leave behind families who remember us. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to look at a series of texts and narratives, and I'll already say that my daughter texted me this morning, my 21-year-old daughter. I don't think it'll surprise anyone who knows me that I have 4 daughters who are all very feminist, and sometimes so feminist that I have to kind of calm things down and say it's okay, men are okay, and it's okay to like share space and look for partnerships and so on. And this struggle of reading rabbinic texts that are so gendered and finding our voices in them, or finding contemporary meaning when women's role, men's role, certainly same-sex relationships can't be reflected in these texts. And yet what I often try to show my students is how the themes or the messages or the voices that rise up from the stories are extremely relatable and have a lot of insight and wisdom in them if we can move past the superficial surface of the gender piece. And so I'm going to bring a number of stories and narratives and show different models that come up, and talk a little bit again of how perhaps people can find something of their relationships in these stories. One of the first, in the first section, I really look at the role women play in the Talmud, the wife and mother. This is really, I call it how to make or break a relationship Talmud style, right? So we're going to see a number of stories. But first and foremost, it's important before we get to the stories to understand a little bit about the role the woman is going to play in the story. And in order to do that, the midrashic texts on woman as wife and mother, the valorization of wife and mother, are helpful before we actually even get into the stories. What does the ideal woman look like? So the first source I bring on the page, Exodus 19:3, is the source in which it says, Ko tomar lebeit Yaakov v'taged lebnei Yisrael. Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel. And so the Midrash recognizes that women are not directly addressed at Sinai. It does say at some point, L'kol ha'am, to all of the nation, but it doesn't say, as it says in other parts of the Torah, anashim v'nashim v'taf, for instance, men, women, and children, or ish v'isha, right? So the question of where are the women doesn't just bother Judith Klaskow when she writes Standing Again at Sinai. It bothers the midrashic authors of Shmot Rabbah, and they come up with, I think, not just a clever interpretation, but I think one that can easily be found in the text, because we have the Beit Yaakov and the Bnei Yisrael, which seems redundant, the house of Jacob and the children of Israel. And the house of Jacob is a very unusual phrase. And so what they're going to say is the house of Jacob are the women. And you can't help but remember that 1,500 years after this midrash is written, Sarah Schneer chooses to call her school for girls, the first real school system for girls that develops in Eastern Europe, Beit Yaakov, Beis Yaakov, which goes on to become ultra-Orthodox, but in its way co-opted the midrashic idea and expanded upon it. So it became bigger and bigger and bigger, and it became essentially the foundation of why and how we must educate daughters. Okay, so what does the midrash say? It says as follows, thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, refers to the women, and declare to the children of Israel, refers to the men. Why were the women addressed first, though? That's a bit of a sticking point, because nonetheless, in ancient Israelite society, men are still the privileged sex. And yet in this pasuk, if we call Beit Yaakov, the house of Jacob, the women, they're being addressed first. So now we have to answer that question. Because they are more diligent in the performance of mitzvot. So this becomes, one of these themes that gets thrown about, that women are more spiritual, women are more diligent, women are more conscientious in their relationship with God. Another explanation, so that they should direct their children to Torah. Now, what emerges from a lot of these texts is the tremendous influence women have over men. That the relationship between men and women in society, and particularly we're in rabbinic text, it's androcentric, it's very much through a male lens, and this awareness that to some degree they are vulnerable to the influence of women, and that women are going to be the ones to direct the children, but specifically the sons, the male children, to studying Torah. Women are the ones who are diligent and essentially are going to inspire the men. And then we have a lovely little vignette where they try to get into the head of God. Rabbi Tachlif of Caesarea said, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, when I created this world, I first commanded Adam, and only afterwards was Eve commanded. However, she disobeyed and brought ruin to the world. Now, if I do not call upon women first, they will render the Torah void. And it's an interesting reflection on God's part, that he made the mistake of talking to Adam first. If he had talked to Eve first, or if he had talked to Eve directly, because God does not command Eve in the biblical text, Adam presumably is the one who told her, then perhaps the whole story would have ended differently. And God corrects and recognizes that the power, the influence of women over men is such that if he does not include the women, inspire the women to accept the Torah at Sinai first, the Torah itself will become void, which is a very, I would say, a powerful recognition from the lens of men, who again, privileged members of society, who recognize that if there isn't a partnership, then none of this is going to work. And ultimately, they are vulnerable to female influence. And without having women in society who are willing to perform the mitzvah diligently, who are willing to send the children to Torah, then the Torah itself is going to be void, and God comes to that understanding. It once happened that a pious man was married to a pious woman. They did not produce children. So what happened? They get divorced. he married a wicked woman and she made him wicked. The latter married a wicked man and made him righteous. This proves it all depends on the women. Okay, so on the women. So in the 20th century and 21st century, I understand that from a feminist perspective, this is apologetic. On the other hand, I do want to give credence to what the rabbis do, which is carve out a very significant role in society for wife and mother. Not all societies do that. Rabbinic Judaism, essentially, with matriarchal, with a matrilineal Judaism, with the Jewish children being birthed from, the wombs of the Jewish women and so on, create a very strong role for the wife and mother, even if it is perhaps a little patronizing and apologetic. Nonetheless, I would like to acknowledge that it also valorizes and romanticizes and acknowledges the weakness of men vis-a-vis their relationship. And so you need to choose wisely. I want to pause for a moment and take gender out of the conversation. We do need to choose wisely, because at the end of the day, women influence men and men influence women and women influence women and men influence men. Who we choose to have as our life partner can often be the difference between being a good person and a wicked person. Finding the person who inspires us, who makes us the best person we can be. That's what I would take from Genesis Rabbah, not the gender piece of the man, the woman, and so on. But the reality is who we choose will often determine the direction we take spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and so on. And so that should be a consideration. We're going to skip down a little bit. These are, again, we're going to skip down. The merit of the righteous women of that generation. Israel was redeemed from Egypt. It really is I get to a midrash, and I go, this is my favorite midrash. Then the next one, this is my favorite midrash. But I really do, I love this midrash because it describes the continued faith of the women to birth children at a time of slavery and despair and despondency and death. And yet they continue to seduce their husbands and birth children, which flies in the face of rational thinking. Again, part of what is being presented here, men are rationalists. They essentially separate from their wives. There's no reason to continue having children when baby boys are being thrown in the Nile, when we have to sacrifice our children. And the righteous women recognize, first of all, what about the baby girls? And second of all, the hope that God will take us out, that there will be an exodus, there will be a redemption. So again, very much a gendered view of differences between men and women. Nonetheless, I think a very beautiful one in giving women so much, a very wide berth for valorizing their role in the exodus. Okay, what we're going to look at now are some of the stories. So I'm really framing that because what you see is, yes, a very gendered relationship, but I think also from the sources, you see the power we have to influence and inspire, or the opposite, to denigrate and bring down. This last source here, it's not good that the man should be alone. It was taught, he who has no wife dwells without good, without help, without joy, without blessing, without atonement. And this idea, again, from the male perspective, men living alone, very difficult for them, and they don't have good and help and so on. And then the man will bring home wheat and flax, but he does not chew wheat and wear flax. She enlightens his eyes and stands him on his feet. This idea that men can't possibly care for themselves if they don't have women. So, okay, we're now going to take a look at some of the stories. Rabbinic couples. This is the stories I'm going to bring. Most of them will be very familiar. Nonetheless, I've created a reading and a contrast between the stories. And so what I'd like to show you really are the Rabbi Akiva stories, which conflict with one another. Two of them really are in conflict with one another, which means neither story could have happened if both stories couldn't have happened, which means both stories are obviously there to teach us a different aspect of Rabbi Akiva's personality and how he became who he became. The one common thread in all of the Rabbi Akiva stories, he starts learning at a very late stage of life, and he has a wife who supports him. Those are pretty much consistent in all of the Rabbi Akiva stories, but then there are major differences with how he becomes the great sage that he becomes. Okay, Rabbi Akiva was called a Savua's shepherd. His daughter saw that he was modest and fine. I do have the Nidarim, good. She said to him, if I become betrothed to you, will you go to the house of the master? Yes, he replied. She was then secretly betrothed to him and sent him away. Her father heard about this, expelled her from his house, and vowed that she would not benefit from his property. So I want to pause for a moment and point out a few things. This version of the story appears in the Tractate of Ketubot. Ketubot is about the marriage contract and about the two-tiered process from Kiddushin to Nisuin. In other words, Kiddushin is where a man betroths a woman and she becomes his legal wife. Nisuin is where they formally begin to live together, where they go to the chuppah and the marriage is then consummated. She is entitled to the ketubah after Kiddushin, even though he does not have to begin providing for her until after Nisuin. From the time of the Mishnah, that was a 12-month gap for virgins. For non-virgins, it was a month. And what's interesting here is the man normally is the initiator of the Kiddushin, right? The man is the one who does the act of betrothal. He turns her from single to married by giving her an object she accepts. In this case, she essentially proposes to him, right? She's the initiator, and to make it even more startling, he leaves after betrothing her. In other words, after Kiddushin, she doesn't even get to the chuppah for 24 years. The marriage is never consummated. She's not entitled to anything. Pay attention to that detail. She's not entitled to the food, clothing, and sexual relations that a woman is normally entitled to in marriage, because he actually never does the second stage, according to this story, which is possibly how he can go away for 24 years without leaving her with any support. Okay, so I feel like the author of this story tweaks it a little bit. It's more shocking because it is Kiddushin, not even Nisuin, but it also helps explain legally why he doesn't really have to come back every so often to consummate or continue, perpetuate the marital intimacy and so on. And it's part of a series of stories that plays with this theme. What I want to show you before we move into the body of the story is that Kalba Savua takes a vow. That's the part that's a little jarring for Ketubot. The second version of the story appears in the Tractate of Vows. Okay, the Tractate of Vows, Kalba Savua's vow makes more sense there because we're dealing with fathers who take vows in moments of anger and then spend many years regretting their vow, but can't really figure out how to get out of it. So I find the Tractate of Nidarim a bit tedious, I have to be honest. The parts that speak to me are these very human moments of people who in moments of pain or anger say things that they end up regretting. And then how do you undo that? How do you undo that damage? And so it's very real to me that Kalba Savua, the wealthy lord of the manor, his daughter marries the poor illiterate shepherd. And in that moment of pain and anger, he cries out and says, by the word of God, you will not inherit a penny of my very bountiful estate. And then how do you come back from that? It takes him 24 years. What I want to show you in the Ketubah, in the Nidarim story though, it's a little small, I apologize. I'll see if I can make it a little bigger. The details are very significant in these stories. He's the shepherd of Kalba Savua. The daughter of Kalba Savua became engaged to Rabbi Akiva, right? We don't know exactly how that happened. In the Ketubot story, she takes the reins. She initiates. She goes after him. She sees his potential. Here it suggests maybe a backyard romance that's going on out around among the sheep. Kalba Savua hears and cuts her off. She went and married him in the winter. So she gets to Nisuin in this story. There's not just the Kiddushin, they get married and they lie in the hay barn together. So if I could create my perfect version of the story, I would incorporate this detail into the Ketubot version. I love this detail. They lie in the barn and he picks the hay out of her hair. It's such an intimate detail. You feel the love they have for each other, the sacrifice they've gone through, and so on. And he's picking the hay out of her hair because, of course, her hair is long and tangled, and the hay is a nuisance. And he says to her, were I only able, I would give you a Jerusalem of gold. So that detail then appears in Ketubot, but you don't really understand why it's in Ketubot or why it's in another version of the story. It's really coming from this version of the story. Elijah the prophet appeared to them as a person crying out at the door. He said, "Give me some of your hay, for my wife is giving birth, and I have nothing for her to lie down on." Rabbi Akiva said to his wife, "You see, there is someone who does not even have hay." And she said to him, "Go and sit in the house of study." So she does become the active person further on in the story. The segue is a little rough, like why he says, "Oh, lucky us that we have hay, they don't even have hay," and she says, "Go study Torah." But okay, you can see that there's a little bit of rough editing in each story, where each story is borrowing from the other. But I wanted to show you this because this model of a relationship to me is a very beautiful picture of partnership, of two people who go to live in the barn. They're in this together. They've sacrificed together. It's not yet clear for what. And then he has a moment of clarity where he says, "Oh, we could be even worse off. Maybe we won't have hay." And her moment of clarity is, "Oh, you need to go study Torah," right? So they each have that moment when Elijah shows up. It just, she ends up, of course, directing where it's going to go. So we go back to the Ketubot story. We know this part of the story is very, very famous. He departs 12 years at the academy. He returns home with 12,000 disciples. I often feel storytellers exaggerate details so we recognize it's a story. I mean, 12,000 disciples showing up in a town is going to make a considerable amount of noise. Hard to believe that she wouldn't have heard the 12,000 disciples and gone out to see what the noise was. But okay, again, it's a story. He overheard an old man ask his wife, "How long will you be like a widow waiting for him?" But she's not a widow, of course. If she was a widow, she'd be free. She'd be able to remarry. She is a betrothed maiden who has not yet made it to the chuppah, and she legally cannot get out without a divorce or the death of her husband. If he would listen to me, she replied, he would spend another 12 years of study. So we understand that she's very much, again, a partner. They don't even need to see each other to talk through the old man. Essentially, he's standing there. She doesn't know he's there. And she says the one thing that essentially he needs to hear to go back and study more Torah. They are soulmates. I have her consent then, said Akiva, and departed for another 12 years. He couldn't even stick around to give her a hug, nothing. Okay, so it's not our version of a romantic story, but there is something very romantic about it. The lovers who don't even need to make love, don't even need to be physically present with one another in order to essentially communicate with one another. He returned home with 24,000 disciples. His wife heard he was returning while with 24,000. Hard not to hear the noise. She went out to greet him. His neighbor said to her, "You should borrow better clothes to greet him." I often use this in the story to, the neighbors have a moment of, I would suggest, tremendous regret. She's going out in rags. Everyone has ignored me. Who's been taking care of this woman for 24 years? And I feel that suddenly they wake up and say, "Oh my God, you can't go out to meet him like that. What's he going to think of us? Where has the community been? Where have we been in supporting you? Like, we've been mocking you. And now suddenly your husband really is a great man coming back. You should borrow better clothes." And she says, "A righteous man knows the soul of his animal." Again, if I were writing the story, that is not the verse that I would choose, but the idea is externals don't matter to us. We speak internally. We speak a different language. When she reached him, she bowed to the ground and kissed his feet. Rabbi Akiva's attendant started to dispel her, and Rabbi Akiva says, "Shali, shalachem, shalahi." Mine and yours are hers. And so, of course, that really is the end of the story. But because there's a piece from Nidarim, from the Tractate of Vows, we need to find out what happened to the vow. And so here, her father heard a great sage came and said, "I shall go to him. Perhaps he will invalidate my vow." Rabbi Akiva then, he doesn't recognize Rabbi Akiva, and he comes to ask the great sage a question. "When you vowed, did you intend to forbid her, even if her husband would become a great scholar?" Then Kalba Savua said, "Had I known that he would learn even one chapter, even one halacha, I would not have vowed." And he says, "I am your son-in-law." And then he bows and kisses his feet, gives half his money, and Rabbi Akiva becomes phenomenally wealthy. There's a lot to do here as a story. There's a lot to do about relationships, about ruptures, about inability to reconcile, how the story might have looked different if one piece had been changed slightly. 24 years, this man has been sitting alone, regretful, devastated that he kicked out his only daughter, and it takes that long until he can find the courage to go and admit what he's done and recognize that there is room for reconciliation. So again, it's also a great pre-Tishrei Elul, Elul Tishrei story. Please don't wait 24 years, but how do we get ourselves to move? How do we pick ourselves up and move away from a situation? Okay. Rabbi Akiva's daughter did the same thing with Ben Azai. This is like people say, a sheep follows a sheep. That's where she becomes known as Rachel. She's not called Rachel in many of the stories, but she becomes known as Rachel. And this idea, Rachel batar Rachel, this idea, sheep follows a sheep. Her daughter did like her mother. I want to point out, children certainly see the models they see at home of the relationships around them, of the relationship their parents have, of the marriage their parents has. Sometimes they need to work to change the model. Sometimes they are very happy to try to emulate the model. But again, the Bavli recognizing children, the daughter did like her mother. Now, the Ben Azai, as an aside, is the man who in Yevamot says, I can't get married because all I want to do is learn Torah. So they find him a good shidduch. Like, this daughter is going to let him learn Torah. He can go away for 24 years. So again, you see this model. I will say it's not valorized in the Talmud. This model is not considered to be an ideal model, going away for 24 years. And the way we really know that is in Ketubot, they end with a different story. This is not the height, this is not the story to end the series of stories of men going away to study Torah with. This is one story. It's really the only story that ends well. And I want to point out there are no children in the story until he comes back after 24 years. So his wife has sent him off. He has not abandoned her and the unborn children or the children and come back 24 years later. They really only pick up and begin a family after this period of time. In all of the other stories, there's terrible tragedy and death and infertility and so on and so forth, and children who are left behind. And this story is a model, but largely the stories about men going away to study Torah do not end well. What's interesting is that the Talmud brings a second version that is I want to say the polar opposite, because it has similar themes. Like we said, Rabbi Akiva starting at a late stage, a wife who supports him. But in this story, he does not go away. So I'm going to read it quickly. I know many of you know this story, but I love stories. Every time I hear these stories, I find something new I hadn't seen the last time. What was the beginning of Rabbi Akiva? It is said when he was 40 years old, he had not yet studied a thing. One time he stood by the mouth of the well. Who hollowed out this stone, he wondered. He was told, it is the water which falls upon it every day continually. It was said to him, Akiva, have you not heard the waters wear away the stones? Akiva then drew the inference with regard to himself. If what is soft wears down the hard, all the more so shall the words of Torah, which are hard as iron, hollow out my heart, which is soft. Forthwith he turned to the study of Torah. So the wife does not have kind of the heroic role she has in the previous, in Nidarim and in Ketubot, where she's the impetus, she's the driving force behind his going away. He comes to it on his own. I certainly invite you, sit down with the stories. If you have children, teenagers, there's so much to mine, adults, right? So much to mine from these stories, from the verses that are used in the stories, the process that Rabbi Akiva goes through till he realizes it's not too late for me. He went together with his son and they appeared before an elementary teacher, said Rabbi Akiva to him, Master, teach me Torah again. Very, very powerful moment where he goes back to kindergarten essentially with his son. We recognize here he is married, he has children, he goes to kindergarten with his son, he learns with him the alphabet and so on and so forth, and he went on studying until he learned the whole Torah. I shortened the story so we could just see the end. I will say there's an amazing visual where he uproots a mountain and throws it into the Jordan River, where that's what he's described as doing, which essentially is uprooting Sinai and moving it to possibly the land of Israel, or changing the whole way we interpret Torah. I mean, there's a lot to do with this story. Each day, Rabbi Akiva would gather a bundle of straw, part he would sell to provide for his food, part for his clothing. His neighbors rose up in protest and said to him, Akiva, you are slaying us with the smoke. Sell the straw to us, and with the money buy oil and study by the light of a lamp. So here it's interesting. The neighbors, I like to read the protest not as a protest but as an attempt to try to help him without embarrassing him. Basically saying, look, sell us the straw, we'll give you money, you can then buy oil and study by the light of a lamp, not by like the dark, dingy fire that's created by straw. So here the neighbors, in my opinion, are trying to help it, okay? And then he says, no, in the future at Judgment Day, Rabbi Akiva will put the poor to life because he was very, very poor. If they say because of our children, they shall be asked, did not Rabbi Akiva have sons and daughters? Again, a much more normative home life. He works in the morning. He has sons and daughters, and then he goes to the academy, and they are told, and this is where she's given a name, Rachel, his wife, had married. At the age of 40, he went to study Torah. At the end of 13 years, he taught Torah to multitudes, and so on and so forth. And basically, he buys her a Jerusalem of gold. Everything is gold, gold tiara. That's the Jerusalem of gold. Master, his disciple, said, you have put us to shame. And he says, many are the trials she endured for my sake, that I may study Torah. So it's always an interesting question. Which is the better story? Which story do you prefer? What do you like about one story over the other? Which relationship do you prefer? Do you prefer the model, kind of these soulmates who don't even have to be physically present in order to connect for 24 years and then they pick up where they were? Or this model where he's home every day, working, they live in abject poverty for many, many years until he reaches the pinnacle of success. Nonetheless, in both, I think it's important to acknowledge that they are partners in all of the stories. There is a partnership here, regardless of who the one, who's going to become the head of cardiothoracic surgery. Of course, Rabbi Akiva becomes the head of the Beit Din, right? So whoever is going to become, X, there has to be support along the way. And Rabbi Akiva very graciously and continuously gives it to his partner, to his wife. So that's really the first model I wanted to bring. I wanted to show you that there are different narratives about that story, and that that if we, again, take a look at the two figures in the middle, gender aside, there's a very strong connection and belief in one another and reinforcement and inspiration. She certainly reflects what the Bavli, the potential that the Bavli feels women, wives, and mothers have to inspire men. Okay, we're now going to take a look at a different couple, Meir and Bruria. And what we have here in Brachot is a dialogue between Meir and Rabbi Meir and Bruria. I give a lecture called The Bruria Stories, where actually I argue that I think Rabbi Meir was probably not married to Bruria historically. Please, no gasps of dismay, but that the stories suggest that she lived at an earlier time period and so on. But as you've probably gathered, I don't think stories need to be historical to be true. In other words, I think stories have a lot of truth in them, have a lot of messages for us, and so it doesn't really matter. I will say there are excellent articles on Bruria. There's been a lot of research done. Rachel Adler wrote one, and someone, I think his first name is John, if someone remembers his name, someone a number of years ago wrote another article. Tom Henkin did a brilliant article before he died on Bruria. So there are a lot of stories, there's been a lot of interest in Bruria because she's one of the major female characters, one of the major women in Talmud. Certain brigands who were in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir used to trouble him greatly. He prayed that they die, meaning that's Rabbi Meir's solution, that they die, so that they stop bothering him. Obviously, they're bullying him terribly, and that's what he prays for. And Bruria, his wife, said to him, what is your opinion? Because it's written, let sin cease. Is sinners written? It says, yitamu chataim, not chotim. It doesn't say that sinners should cease and desist. It says sins should cease and desist. Furthermore, cast your eyes to the edge, or rishayim od einam, they are wicked no more. Since sins will cease, they will be wicked no more. He prayed for them and they repented. And there are a very small number of stories where Bruria comes out as the sharper, more clever of the two in dialogues that they have. And what I didn't bring was again, the very famous story that leads Rashi, or pseudo Rashi, possibly, to suggest that Rabbi Meir has her seduced by his student, and then she kills herself, and Rabbi Meir runs away. Terrible ending in a Rashi that it's not clear is a Rashi. I didn't bring that story. That's not what I'm interested in focusing on. What I'd like to bring you is a story about a tragedy and how she seems to understand her husband and how to tell him about this tragedy. So again, this is a story that I have read many times and come to feel there's a lot of depth and wisdom and kindness in how she gives him the news. What a rare find is a capable wife. Her worth is far beyond that of rubies. Okay, a tale is told of Rabbi Meir that while he was sitting and expounding in the academy on a Shabbat afternoon, his two sons died. Terrible tragedy. He's in the academy. He has no idea. What did their mother do? I will point out, Bruria is not mentioned in the story by name. She's anonymous in the story. We can fill it in as we wish. She left them both lying on their couch and spread a sheet over them. At the close of the Shabbat, Rabbi Meir came home from the academy and he asked her, "Where are my two sons?" So the first thing he says where are they? Something's wrong. He has intuitively understood, whether because they usually come and daven mincha and ma'ariv with him, he sees them playing outside. So the first thing he asked, and she says, well, they went to the academy. He says, I looked for them at the academy, but did not see them. He's not shalem. He's agitated. Something's not right. He can feel it, but she is going to gently leak information, as we'll see. She handed him the cup for the Havdalah service, and he pronounced it. Now, then he asked her again, where are my two sons? I think what she does here is she has him say Havdalah, right? He needs to finish Shabbos. Before she gives him the news, there is a protocol. And once she gives him this news, it cannot be undone. And she allows him to say Havdalah so that Shabbat can end before he moves into a stage of life he could not have anticipated. And he will have that closure. Shabbat ends with Havdalah. She gives him that peace of mind. He then says again, where are my two sons? She says, well, sometimes they go someplace, they'll be back presently. Meaning she again deflects, and she serves him his meal, and he ate, and he recites the Birkat HaMazon. And I find that also that detail, and I'm not sure people pick up on it. She feeds him. And I feel like, again, that's what she nurtures him. She knows he's going to need his strength. He may, again, once he knows the news, who knows when he's going to eat again, when he's going to be able to eat again. She not only has him eat, he washes, he benches. Again, she gives him strength, she nurtures him, she cares for him. She makes sure he's ready physically to receive this. He says his Birkat HaMazon, and now she's going to begin unfolding what has to be unfolded. So I really feel there's something very feminine in her having him reach, again, people have read this and said to me, she's very cold, like they're saying very cold about her. I feel she's completely focused on him and getting him through this process, and perhaps that's her way of dealing with the tragedy. He's going to close Shabbat with the Havdalah, and then she's going to feed him and make sure he's strong, and then she's going to now ask him how they're going to get through this. Master, I have a question to ask you. He replied, ask your question. She said, Master, some time ago, a certain man came by and left something on deposit with me. Now he has come to reclaim this deposit. Shall I return it to him or not? He replied, my daughter is not one who holds a deposit obligated to return it to its owner. Now, also what I love about this is she distracts him by talking to him Torah, halacha, right? We're like in Baba Kama here. And he knows something's wrong, but now she asks him in a language that he can respond to, and she's now going to turn it into what she's going to turn it into. She said, without your opinion, I would not give it back to him. What did she then do? She took him by the hand, led him to the children, brought him to the bed, removed the sheet. He saw them lying there. He burst into tears. My sons, my masters, my natural born sons, and my master who enlightened me with their learning in Torah. Now I have to say at this point, I would have ended the story here. Again, no one asked me to come and edit these stories. And then she says to him, Master, did you not just now tell me we must return a pledge to its owner? So I have to say I don't love that line. Like I feel like that line is a little dissonant. Like leave him, master, with some sort of closure. But the story ends the way it ends, and she tries to remind him of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and essentially it belongs, everything belongs to God, and so on. A nice pasuk here might have done a little better, but I find something very powerful in the dynamic of the process she leads him through. He knows as soon as he comes back from shul, something's wrong. He knows, you see it, he asks, where are they, where are they, where are they? And she has the ability to kind of control how this is going to play out. And I think largely she does it I feel she does it gently until the last line where I can't I can't redact the story, but I will say I think there's something powerful in the dynamic there. And I want to suggest, as in the last story I'm going to bring, we're not really going to get to Rabbi Eliezer and Shalom, is you see the specialness, the relationship of Rabbi Meir with his wife affects the relationship he has with women, and in a good way. Vayikra Rabbah. Rabbi Meir used to sit and teach on the Shabbat nights. A certain woman was there listening to him. So first of all, he has women who come to hear his Torah Friday night, right? That's huge. Once and that makes sense. If you're married to a woman like Bruria, if you're married to a scholarly woman, then you're not threatened or afraid by other women coming and listening to you teach Torah and being part of that conversation. Once his discourse was extended, and she waited until he had finished discoursing. And he went over time, which I'm going to try not to do. But you know, you get carried away, you've got an idea, it's taking longer than you thought, and he goes over time. She went home and found the candle extinguished. Now that's a euphemism. The candle really is extinguished, right? Because on Friday night, you can't really light the candle, but Friday night's really mitzvah night. It's the night a couple are meant to connect intimately, have sexual relations, the candle of passion. And when she gets back later than usual from hearing this very charismatic rabbi teach Torah, the candle has been extinguished. There's consequence here. And her husband said to her, it should be said to her, "Where were you?" She said to him, "I was sitting and listening to the teacher. I did nothing wrong." She stayed away the first week, the second, and the third. As a result of Rabbi Meir's consideration, his carelessness with time, he has ruptured a marriage. Now, there's something very fragile that has gotten him here. A man, and he has women coming to hear his Torah. I will say that space is a complicated space, the professor-student dynamic. And so, you know, her husband, it seems, has put up with this as long as she's back by 10 o'clock at night. And this, but one can imagine there's tension under the surface that after dinner she goes to hear Rabbi Meir teach Torah. And when her husband says to her, "Where were you?" I mean, he knows where she was. "I was sitting and listening to the teacher." He says, I'm sorry, "I swear to you, you will not enter here until you go and spit in the face of the teacher." There's a jealousy here, there's a tension here, and she doesn't know what to do. And she leaves the home. She stays away the first week, the second week, the third. Her neighbor women, and here we have the neighbor women, right? Neighbor women appear in a number of stories, especially with women. "Are you still angry with each other?" Well, yes. This has been a terrible rupture in this marriage. Inadvertently, Rabbi Meir has triggered it. And the question is, how is this couple going to reconcile? Who's ultimately responsible for bringing them together? And the women say, "We'll come with you to the teacher." Third party, I love it, right? Sometimes you do need a neutral third party to come in and help move things forward. And the neighbor women take it upon themselves. They say, "We're going to go with you. You're going to do this." When Rabbi Meir saw them, he saw by the Holy Spirit. Basically, Holy Spirit aside, Rabbi Meir has obviously noticed that something has happened. It's not clear to me she's gone back to the Torah study class. It's not clear. She certainly hasn't gone home. And I feel Rabbi Meir in that moment has clarity and realizes that he's caused this, meaning his need to keep speaking after the bell rang has led to this rupture. And I would also say teachers often have to be mindful of many dynamics that happen in the classroom and not get caught up in the adulation or admiration of the students, because that can lead to inappropriate connections or possibly even inappropriate, on the part of the student to the teacher, misunderstandings. Rabbi Meir is accountable here, and I feel like he gets that. He said to them, "Is there anyone among you who has learned in the magical curing of eyes?" The magical curing of eyes is to spit in the eye. I would not suggest doing that today. We know about germs and so on, certainly not in the period of Corona, but is there anyone among you? Her neighbor said to her, "Go spit in his face, you will be permitted to your husband." When she sat before him, she withdrew from him. She said to him, "Rebbe, I don't know how to do this." She does not want to spit in the face of Rabbi Meir. That's what her husband has demanded of her. And yet, how can she do this? He said to her, "Spit in my face 7 times. And then he said to her, "Go tell your husband, you said 1 time, I spat 7 times. And so Rabbi Meir not only allows himself to be humiliated, which he does, he takes responsibility for what happened because he understands that inadvertently he has caused this, and ultimately the consequence has to come back to him. And he says to her, I want you to go tell your husband you spat 7 times because I want him to understand I'm not there's not a game here. I'm not trying to seduce, like I'm not in this. I'm putting myself out there so you understand. I understand that I crossed a line and now I'm pushing it all the way back. She spat in my face 7 times, which presumably she does. His disciples then said to him, Rabbi, are we permitted to dishonor thus the Torah? Should you not have requested of one as thus that we say an incantation? And he said to them, is it not enough for Meir to be like his maker? Rabbi Yishmael said, peace is so important that a name written in holiness can be erased in the water in order to establish peace between a husband and wife. So Rabbi Meir has inadvertently caused a sota situation. He's the man that the husband suspects. He's the man who has caused the husband this unbelievable jealousy. And so I feel, again, this accountability and this responsibility and this willingness to be publicly humiliated because of it and to take ownership over what happened. And I'd like to suggest it's because of who he's married to. In other words, both his ability to have women come into his classroom and his ability to also recognize there is a tenuous dynamic that one has to be aware of when there are married women in a classroom. And again, it could be all sorts of dynamics, but that he as the teacher had to be responsible for what happened in that classroom. I feel like I'd like to give credit to his marriage and to the woman who influences him and inspires him. And again, like Rabbi Akiva, but different because they obviously are together and she's a learned woman in her own right. There is a partnership, there is conversation and communication, and there is influence one of the other, which is why it's unthinkable to me what Rashi writes that Rabbi Meir had his student seduce his wife, meaning that just it goes against every other story we have, including this particular one. The last couple who we're not really going to get to is Rabbi Eliezer and Ima Shalom. Again, also a very interesting couple. Ima Shalom, mother of peace, right? She tries to build bridges, reconcile between her husband and her brother. A lot of tension between Rabban Gamliel, her brother, and Rabbi Eliezer, her husband. And so, in the famous story of the oven of Achnai, in the end, she is unable to save her brother. He ends up dying because of her husband. Not directly because of her husband, but indirectly, inadvertently, and again, an interesting female character. But we're not going to go into that because I don't like to rush through sources. So what I'd like to really do is talk about some of the themes that come up that I think really are relevant. This idea of listening to one another, consideration for one another, respect for one another, empowering the people. It could be a spouse, it could be a parent, a child, it could be a student. The ability to empower, supporting people in the community who are struggling, right? As opposed to at the moment where everything is finally going well, saying, oh, now can I jump on that bandwagon? So I think relationships, especially the last one, Rabbi Meir and Berea, that last story, are made up of a lot of different dynamics that push and pull against them. And of course, it's up to us to decide and choose and try to work with the relationships we have, and it seems to me here we are 18 years later, still very much in a relationship with Marla and Ben. I really can see Marla's smile when I close my eyes. That there's a beautiful picture in Pardes, and this idea that we can continue to be in relationships with people even after they have passed away. What Amanda did, visualizing what kind of teachers they would be. The relationships continue. Their power to inspire, to empower us, even after they pass away, is very palpable, especially when they're good people and they leave behind that legacy of goodness, of warmth, of humor, of compassion. So thank you very much for joining me to commemorate. And if anyone, I don't know if Catherine, you want to say a word, if anyone wants to say a final word, I'm going to hope their memories will be a blessing to all of us.
I do want to say a final word, and my final word is a thank you to Nechama, a thank you to Pardes, a thank you to Amanda, a thank you to all of those people who have kept Ben and Marla's memory alive. I don't think Blut and I have ever expressed to you guys how much it means to us to know that every year somebody thinks about our son and what he would have done, and Amanda, what he would be doing. We obviously miss him greatly, but I think the real tragedy at Hebrew University was what Amanda alluded to, that a huge number of students lost two very talented teachers. And I commend Pardes for remembering, and I commend Pardes for continuing to train educators so that students will benefit from Torah learning. Thank you guys so much for what you do.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Nechama. Yehי Zichron Baruch. May the memories be blessed.